The Goblin Barrel is one of the most polarizing cards to ever be added into Clash Royale. The card has players divided into two camps, those who love the Goblin Barrel and those who absolutely can't stand it. So why has this card been such a hot topic consistently over the course of the game's history? On the surface, the card looks fairly innocent and simple to use, but players have discovered over the years that there is actually much more than meets the eye with this card in terms of strategy. From countless balance changes to the recent addition of the card's very own evolution to the game, let's dive into the rich history of Clash Royale's Goblin Barrel. The Goblin Barrel was one of the original 42 cards added to Clash Royale with the game's global launch in early 2016. The card made its debut on the stronger side in terms of balancing, as a level 8 Goblin Barrel would actually spawn level 14 goblins initially. While this was a bit overpowered, it isn't as severe as it seems on the surface, since Clash Royale's level system wasn't equalized across rarities like it is today. When the game was first released, common cards like the Goblins used to be capped at level 13, but Supercell later ended up moving all of the rarities up so that they would start at a higher level and all of the cards would end up maxing out at level 13 for consistency. This meant that the Goblins in the Goblin Barrel were actually initially one level higher than max level, much like how the mirror works today. This issue ended up bringing the Goblins into the very first update in Clash Royale's history, which was a week after the game's release, when Supercell opted to decrease the Goblin level to the equivalent level of the Barrel, which brought it more in line with the other cards in the game. A month later, the Goblin Barrel's Crown Tower damage was also decreased from 50% to 40%, and in the coming months, Supercell would fix a couple of other minor bugs and inconsistencies with the card, allowing it to stabilize and start finding its true place in the game's meta. The strategy with this card, as mentioned before, was pretty simple. Players would simply place the card onto either of the opponent's princess towers, usually directly on top of the tower, which would split the goblins around the tower, negating the risk of splash cards like the wizard deleting the goblins instantly. This strategy could be made stronger by using a tank like the giant to take the fire from the towers and or the defending troops so that the goblins could deal a lot of damage. Players quickly discovered though that the opponent couldn't necessarily always tell exactly where the barrel would land until the last second, depending on where the barrel was placed. Keep in mind, the log was not even in the game at this point, so countering the barrel wasn't as simple as it can be today. With both of these facts in mind, I'm sure you can see why players started switching up the placement of the barrel to try and catch their opponents off guard, since this could allow for massive tower damage if done properly. The main deviation from the normal placement in the center, which I will refer to as tower placement from now on, was what is commonly referred to as a tricky barrel, where the barrel is placed exactly 3 tiles above the opponent's princess tower. This placement looks the most similar to the tower placement from the opponent's point of view until later in the animation, giving the defending player less time to react and making it likely that they would misplace their counters to the card and take a lot of damage. The tower placement and the tricky barrel were the two main placements at this time, since good counters to the Goblin Barrel, like the Log and the Barbarian Barrel, had not been added to the game yet. This switching up of the placement leads us to our first point that many players hate about the card, which is that Goblin Barrel players are known for being quite smug, for lack of a better word. It was very common for players to spam different laughing emotes after successfully tricking their opponent with a different barrel placement, and this was obviously pretty frustrating for the defending player. This smugness and emote spamming wasn't unique to Goblin Barrel players per se, but they definitely made up a large portion of this group, especially in the early days of the game's history. One thing to mention with this card is that it actually costed 4 elixir initially, but Supercell decided in July of 2016 to decrease the cost to 3 in an attempt to make the card more viable. A couple of months later, in September, a new legendary card would be added to the game, a card that would become Goblin Barrel's biggest opponent, the Log. The Log had a very large range and dealt damage and knockback to any troops in its path, killing things like goblins and skeletons immediately. The opposition that the Log created for Goblin Barrel players would end up forcing them to grow by utilizing tricky barrels more frequently and ensuring their placements weren't predictable. Players also started to include other cards like the Princess and Goblins into their decks to try and bait out the opponent's Log before using their Goblin Barrel or Princess to get chip damage on the defending player's tower, and thus Log bait was born. It wasn't until early 2017 though, several months later, where the Goblin Gang would be added to the game, which was not only a third card with the goblins in it that Supercell would need to consider when balancing, but also a very important puzzle piece in crafting the perfect log bait deck. Players quickly began using Goblin Gang with the Goblin Barrel and Princess, and the trio put up quite a challenge for anyone trying to prevent chip damage on their tower. As a result, the classic log bait deck that we all know and most of us don't love was popularized as a solution to the log's dominance in taking care of the Goblin Barrel. 2017 would also mark the first major glitch in the Goblin Barrel's history, in which players were able to place the Goblin Barrel at a specific time in the touchdown game mode so that it would be in the air fire when the map was cleared, and the goblins would score a free touchdown. I talked about this glitch in my glitches video, so I won't elaborate more here, but check out that video after you finish this one if you haven't already. Later that same year, Supercell actually ended up nerfing the goblins' damage by 6%. Now this brings us to one of the tricky things about balancing with this card. The standard goblins, sometimes called stab goblins, have appeared in multiple cards ever since the game's launch, originally just the goblins and the Goblin Barrel, but eventually being included within the Goblin Gang and even the evolved Mortar as one of the first few evolutions in the game. You see, Supercell wants to avoid ever having to make separate versions of troops in the game for balancing, since this would make interactions confusing and not as consistent. So if they want to balance the goblins, these changes will have an effect on multiple different cards in the game, for better or for worse. So this 6% damage nerf was made to the goblins and applied to the Goblin Barrel by extension, which did make the card a bit less viable than before. In early 2018, Supercell released an alternative to the log, the Barbarian Barrel. This card was essentially the same thing as the log, but it sacrificed some of the log's range and its knockback for a barbarian that would be spawned once the barrel reached the end of its path. The Barbarian Barrel had a slightly smaller width than the log, which forced logbait players to develop the side placement as an option for their barrels, in which players would place their Goblin Barrel one tile to either side of the opponent's Princess Tower, allowing the outermost goblin to avoid the barrel and potentially get a stab or two of chip damage in if the opponent messed up their Barb Barrel. The Barbarian Barrel was definitely another hurdle for logbait players to tackle, but it was ultimately dealt with in almost the exact same way as the log. While we're on the topic, the final placement that is widely used for the Goblin Barrel is a front placement in which the Goblin Barrel is dropped directly in front of the opponent's Princess Tower so that the goblins can spawn and do damage before the log actually reaches them. This obviously only works when the opponent plays their log further back, so a logbait player would need to adjust their placements to take advantage of how their opponent is countering their barrels. In the first few years after the game was launched, Supercell did several very small balance changes to certain cards to specifically fix certain interactions to be what they wanted them to be. A good example of this would be a balance update also in early 2018, where Supercell would decrease the hit points of the goblins by just 1%, which made it so that minions of the same level would take out goblins in 2 hits instead of 3. As far as balancing goes, the Goblin Barrel would rarely be featured in balance changes from this point on, as Supercell did a great job of fitting the card into a strong but manageable position in the meta with the changes I already mentioned. In the middle of 2019 though, Supercell would give a small buff to the Goblin Barrel in the form of a decrease in spawn time from 1.2 seconds to just 1.1 seconds, allowing the goblins to appear and deal damage just a little bit quicker after the barrel landed. Logbait was already strong at this time, and this small buff definitely helped logbait players become even more dominant since opponents had a bit less time to react to their barrels. For the entirety of 2020, the Goblin Barrel was not included in any balance changes, and the next year in 2021, the only change made to the barrel was that it was now unlockable in Barbarian Bowl instead of Goblin Stadium, meaning players had to play the game a bit more before unlocking the card. In mid-2023, Supercell released the Evolved Mortar as the 5th card evolution in the game, and players were quite surprised to see that the evolution made the mortar fire a goblin on top of each shot when evolved. This mechanic was obviously somewhat similar to the Goblin Barrel, so players tried using the 2 cards together, but the cards didn't end up synergizing as well together as they thought, so the idea was largely abandoned. In late May of 2024, Supercell released a teaser regarding an evolution with goblins, and many players were excited to see what this evolution would be. Although many assumed it would be the goblins, Supercell actually ended up choosing the Goblin Barrel and giving it an evolution of its own. The Goblin Barrel's evolution is very unique in that every time you play the evolved barrel, a decoy barrel is placed in the opposite lane in the same location. These decoy goblins are like little puppets that only have 40% of the health of the regular goblins, but they do the same damage, meaning if you could get something to tank for them, the evolution would technically just give players 2 barrels for the price of 1, which is absolutely insane. This evolution is still very new as of the release of this video, so only time will tell what creative and unique strategies emerge with this new evolved Goblin Barrel. I think it's safe to say that the classic logbait deck has remained the most popular deck to include the Goblin Barrel for the vast majority of the game's history, and now that this deck has the option for the evolved Knight and the evolved Goblin Barrel in it, I think that players will find renewed excitement and enjoyment in using logbait, and new players will surely give the deck a try themselves if they haven't already. The Goblin Barrel has ultimately been a very polarizing card that is loved by many and hated by others. At the end of the day, I think it would be hard to imagine Clash Royale without the Goblin Barrel. It has become such an iconic card and has even spawned an entire archetype of decks, logbait, in its wake. It is anyone's guess what the future holds for the Goblin Barrel, but especially with the addition of the evolution, I think it is safe to say that the Goblin Barrel and logbait are here to stay. Only a very small percentage of you guys who watch my videos are actually subscribed, so if you enjoyed the video, subscribe to help us get to 1,000 subscribers.